Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here today. I'm Elizabeth Goldstein, the president of MAS, and thank you for joining us for this virtual MASterworks conversation celebrating the Staten Island Animal Care Center, the 2023 MASterworks honoree for the best new building. Every year, we're thrilled to celebrate excellence in architecture and urban design through our MASterworks Awards. The Animal Care Center is an exciting and innovative project that I can't wait to explore more during today's conversation. Before we begin, I'd like to direct your attention to the chat where MAS staff has placed some helpful tips, including information about closed captioning for today's program. If you need any assistance during the event, feel free to message MAS using the chat function. And throughout the event, really, we do encourage you to add questions to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask questions of our speakers. We'll answer these questions during the conversation portion of the event and so on. So this afternoon, we'll be learning more about this incredible public resource, which acts as a comfort and humane space for animals on Staten Island awaiting adoption. With a sleek design and plentiful access to natural light, the center is a wonderful environment for both staff and animals. Garrison Architects worked on this project in collaboration with civil engineers Worrell and O'Mara, landscape architects Wallace, Roberts, and Todd, structural engineers, Murray Engineers, mechanical engineers, Plus Group Consulting Engineering, and lighting designer Klein Beatrice Bernstein Lighting Design. It's my enormous pleasure to introduce James Garrison, principal at Garrison Architects, who will represent the project team and dive deeper into how this project came to be. Jim is an architect and educator whose work expands the boundaries of sustainability, demonstrating how modern architecture can address the ecological realities of our era. Garrison believes that teaching and practicing reinforce each other. So in addition to working at his own firm, he also teaches at the Pratt Institute. Jim will be joined periodically by Anthony Andrews, also of the Garrison architecture team. Now, Jim will share a presentation on the project and take us on a virtual tour on this rainy, blustery day of the Care Center. Then I will follow, I will join him for a conversation about this project, public projects in New York City, and much more. Please take it away, Jim.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks very much to the Municipal Art Society for being so forward in all of these matters. I am going to share my screen, and we'll get started. So, buildings, I'm always reminded, in architecture school, we tend to think of them as individual acts. And when we read architectural history, we think, oh well, it was Borromini or Michelangelo or Gordon Bonshaft that did this, that, or the other thing. But the reality is that they are the most communal activities that we undertake. And they have a cast of characters that's a mile deep. And they all work for a long time in collaboration to get things done. So Elizabeth mentioned some of them, but can't leave out the Department of Design and Construction, the Design Excellence program that David Burney brought under the Bloomberg administration to the design of public buildings. I can't forget the Animal Care Centers, the Department of Health, and everyone who just pushed and pushed and pushed. And of course, special thanks to Anthony Andrews, who stayed with it throughout. And it's a long process to build public buildings. So he deserves kudos because it's takes a lot of forbearance. So let me take you through the building. So first of all, where is it? So you see Manhattan, and you see Staten Island, and you see Perth Amboy, and the Outer Bridge Crossing is right there, and that red dot is where the Animal Care Center is. It is an old industrial area now that has some commercial pieces. Of course, it's filling in with housing, you see. And there's the Outer Bridge Crossing. And if we zoom in just one more time, you see we have shopping centers, we have construction lots, we have all kinds of things. So for an architect, context is everything, and trying to figure out what to do in this kind of context is an interesting question. When we first started, there was an existing animal care center over here, and it was a problem for the folks who used it because the mechanical systems mixed up the sick and well animal air, and they could not untangle it. And that is sort of the lead into what really generates these kinds of designs, which is that they are hospitals, really, and hospitals for animals. And it's very, very important that the animals, sick animals and well animals and animals of unknown stature are handled properly. So you'll see how that all runs. You see, it's a very simple building. It is basically a square building with a recessed light well in the middle, into which all the mechanical systems that take care of what I was just describing are placed. It was one of the things that we encountered when we started designing this is the animal shelters, old animal shelters across the country, and the animal shelter here are hold animals in large holding rooms without any separation, and they end up, particularly the dogs, getting into a kind of feedback loop where they bark and bark and bark, and it becomes intolerable, and they become nervous, and everybody suffers. So our thought was, well, why don't we take these animals and why don't we put them in the light rather than putting them in the middle of the building? Why don't we try to make an environment that is calm, light-filled, has fresh air, and the people are taking care of the animals so they can move around the building, dealing with the animals, but that the light for the building would be to the outside. And then you may have noticed where those mechanical rooms are, where the building has its recess, that actually allows light to be shared inside. So that's the way the building works. It is a very simple building, and it uses a very small structural grid. And our interest as architects is to synthesize architecture, engineering, environmental issues. So they're tied together, and they can't really be separated. So here you see, these are the mechanical pieces in the middle. These are the various treatment rooms and so forth. And here's the cats and the dogs. And you see that the building is designed to allow air to pass through, to allow sunlight to pass through from various sides. And it basically is filled with light throughout the day. And here's the kind of drawings that architects like to make. It shows the animal cages, the entry, service yard, fencing, the structure, the mechanical ductwork, the skin, the translucent skin, and the mechanical pieces in an exploded drawing. So one of the most interesting things about architecture these days, to me, is, well, when we draw it now, we have such descriptive means that we often can foresee what the outcome will be. It used to be it was really a lot of guesswork, right? You came to know architecture through drawing and experience, but now we have tools that allow us to really, really dial it in. So this is one of our initial images, and you see the wildflowers in the foreground, which is all part of its lead programming and so forth. And you see the way the light is meant to go through it. And here it is in its final form. And you see it very, very similar, and don't quite have the same view. And of course, the tree's much larger because you can kind of measure how long it took to build it by how much the trees grew. The entry, and you see the entry has this yellow portal that you go through, which is meant to work with the wildflowers. And that is where the cats are meant to hang out. So the cats are in the window. And you can also see the structure and so forth, which is very light and meant to be very minimal behind the skin. And here it is, and you can see some of the light coming through. Now the light's in behind us, so you don't see too much coming through in this direction, but you get the idea. And I'll just come through these kind of quickly. So we like to work with various materials. Polycarbonate with many, many layers of air-filled cavities makes a very well-insulating skin. We work with powder-coated metals. aluminums. This is the grillage that runs around the building and allows fresh air to flow through for the animals. And here's the crew that runs it. They're an amazing crew. They are, I think people who deal with animals are hopelessly optimistic at all times, and really the most wonderful people you can imagine to build for. And in the evening, as the sun goes down, you can see what it's like as it's illuminated from the inside. So the building really, a lot of times architecture is a matter of applying forms or making a building look a certain way deliberately. And although I can't say we're not deliberate, what we try to do is make the visual character of the building, the form of the building, an outcome of its purpose, its materials, and its structure. So we don't really want you to be able to tease away the form. We want it all to be essential to the understanding of the building. So here is actually the corner of that recessed roof sticking into the lobby, allowing light to come in. And, everything's very tight because this is for the city, and the animals, of course, don't get, they're not funded like Geffen Hall, for instance. So, they get that it is always an exercise in efficiency. These are what the corridors around the building, or the spaces around the building are like. And you see all this ductwork because this ductwork is pulling air off of these, it's exhausting air from each one of these individual cages, and then it's supplying air. And there also, you see there's light, you can just see the edge of it coming through here, and there's light coming through here. So they're really moving tremendous amounts of air. It's kind of like a respiration machine. And you can see the materials, they're rough and tough. They're ground face concrete block and stainless steel and polycarbonate. Now we're going to try to play this video. See how it goes here. All right, so here we are. You can see the outer bridge crossing in the background. We're going to swing around. You can see the neighborhood, which is with the abandoned construction vehicles on one side of the building. You see the mechanical apparatus sticking out of the roof. So the building's a bit, it's a world unto itself because it exists in a world where, there's not a lot of street life except for automobiles. There's not a lot of neighborhood traffic except for people come and visit it. We like to use these drones these days. We use them before we design now and afterwards to see how we did. It'll come around in a minute. Sometimes I think we should edit a little more, but there you go. So here you can see actually the structure behind the polycarbonate. You see people using the building within. And now we're scanning by basically moving up the street. You see the ventilation gear. You see a little bit of mechanical sticking out here. The building entrance, someone taking their dog home. And now we come in this is the vehicular entrance. And the signage, which Goodness Design did a really lovely job of. And so we want to make a certain amount of an experience out of the entrance. And we have wildflowers and a kind of which need to be cut back in the fall and then regrow every year. Here you can see some of the metalwork and people using the building. And so the integration of all these pieces and parts, getting that corner and that corner to align and be resolved is something that Anthony basically was in charge of. He did a spectacular job of it. You can see how beautifully integrated it is. And this is public work, so round of kudos to the team that got it together. They're little portholes, which you can see the cattery, called the cattery, and it was imagined a bit as we designed or as we built, because we wanted the kids and families to be able to sit in it with the cats. So it changed a little bit as we went. Here you see the light changing as it comes through. And here's Anthony demonstrating how we enter the building. And the cats now are the residents. They are the primary residents of the lobby. And you can see some of the light coming through. So the clear story above us and the cats being tended to, and entry into the various portions of the building, left and right. And here's the kind of center of things, right, where all the work happens. This sort of center hallway, which you see is extremely technical. And Anthony's turned and going around one of the exterior walkways, and he's going to be now in the dog holding area, walking toward the lobby. And here comes one of the pooches. Now, animal shelters have evolved a great deal. And and this is a kind of parting shot of the structure, the way the corner is basically without structure, and light pours through the building to give us this kind of ghosted effect of what's inside. And part of the reason it's translucent, by the way, is because we want the dogs to see out, but we don't want them to be too bothered by things. So, too excited by the things in the street. And then just one last thing to say. This building is a memorial to a young man named Tommy Monahan, who loved his animals and his hiking and so forth very dearly. And this is a memorial to his act of saving his animal. And, that's it's a wonderful thing. Their family's been very involved in this all the way through. So we really take our hats off to them and to Tommy's memory. All right, that's the end of the show.
Thank you. That's fantastic, Jim. It's really helpful. And I know we're all grateful that we're not out in the bluster and rain today looking at the building, but I certainly know we want to try and get out there at some point to experience it in person with you someday, not too far from now. So I'm sure that the audience is interested in the interactions that you had with the animal experts, the people who know their way around what kind of care here would be helpful. And I can't help but ask whether there were expert animals involved in the design as well, but especially the humans. We'd love to hear a little more about that.
Well, animal care has been evolving. I mean, it was evolving in the midst of our designing and building this. I mean, this has been, this was underway for quite a long time. And the standard for animal care from the time we started the building to today has totally shifted. From these dormitories full of, rancorous dogs to individual individual holding rooms with the ability to take care of the air and the feeding of the dogs, so and the cats, of course, which are less of a problem. But yeah, so it has evolved. Now, we had animal experts, and their requirements and their approach changed constantly through the design. So there's a lot of evolution in that, and through not just through the design, but through the construction.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. That's wonderful. Did they bring any dogs and cats in to test it out before you were totally done?
No, they They were just trying to move things along. Yeah.
I'm sure. I'm always thrilled by the MASterworks winners because there's always a preponderance of projects like this one that are public in some way. And, you won for the best new building, which is, there was some stiff competition. And it is indeed a very public building. Can you share with us a little bit more about your firm's interest in taking on a project like this and how it fits in your client base?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, we've always felt that public buildings are the highest accomplishment or contribution that any architect can make, because they serve all of us, and they're built with our collective monies and efforts. And, there's nothing more important in this world than to give us all great public buildings, I think. Having said that, making public buildings is not easy. And, there are all kinds of fail safes to deal with graft corruption. There are processes, there are hoops that one goes through, and there are changing political winds in everything. Now, a building takes, the average time that the city of New York takes to build a building is 8 years, which is a bit scandalous. It should be faster, but it is a reflection of how complex that system of checks, balances, and process is. So, I think when we teach in the architecture school, we always emphasize the public building as the most important of events. And one of the things that we loved about, now we participated in the federal, when the Kennedy administration started, there was an interest in establishing a kind of federal standard for public design, which always in the United States, there always wavers between being progressive or being historic, right? And Daniel Patrick Moynihan advocated for this idea of a progressive architecture, which was to be used for our courts and our public buildings. And that, over the years, eventually filtered its way into our administrations here in New York. And when the Bloomberg administration took over and David Burney took it over, they took a look at the design excellence program that the feds were using, which we've worked in. It's a wonderful program. And but now both programs are more or less gone away, and wait for the next recognition that these things are as important as they are.
Yes, and I think we've all experienced the ups and downs, and read in the front pages of our New York Times about the ups and downs of various administrations and the question of whether government should drive more classical architecture, to your point, or more new and innovative architecture, and especially in a moment when sustainability is an extremely important aspect of everybody's work, especially in the public sector. That's a very important, that can influence things a lot. So you've talked about this a little bit, but I'd love you to talk a little more in detail about how the approach to this building might, how it might be different from having a private client. Did you approach the design and materiality of the project in any way that's differently? If you were doing an animal shelter for the ASPCA, for instance, would it have been different? And I'm also interested, obviously a project that takes 8 years and where the staff and is giving you changing expectations about animal care must have affected the budget. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how those changes happened and integrated into what you were doing, or not.
Oh, no, sure. No, sure. I mean, the ASPC, I don't know that it would have changed that much, Elizabeth. I think, the contemporary, maybe they would have been more progressive about the way in which animals were, they looked to the future from the beginning, perhaps. But all the people who get involved in animal care are not doing it to get rich and famous.
No, of course.
Right. So, they have the best of intentions. I mean, you're right. When things change during construction, it causes a certain amount of complexity, maybe quite a bit of complexity. And Anthony can really talk about that. I mean, the thing is that we budget our buildings based on sometimes incomplete information. And that's one of the most important things that any administration, any public administration can do is to accurately and honestly, budget their works, because, you don't want to go back to the well, and you want to make sure you know what you're doing, because that slows everything down. I don't know, Anthony, what would you say about the complexities of a changing construction menu?
Yeah,
I
both
mean,
the program and the budget.
yeah, I think that was definitely a big factor on this project, in terms of sort of the speed of completion. But I mean, I think at the end of the day, you have to be working with people who, are willing to make those changes. And in construction, that's almost impossible. So, whether or not the city or a private agency could have dealt with the blows better or worse, I'm not sure. But I know that everyone that worked on this team did their best to kind of roll with the punches and come up with what you end up having to do is to come up with innovative solutions as you go based on what you have. So there's all sorts of ways that they use the building now that are maybe their processes are slightly different than when we designed the project. So it's interesting, and I've had ongoing conversations with them about how things have changed, and it's interesting to see. And that's always obviously a best practice for an architect to go back and say, okay, how's the building performing? What can we do better next time? So it's an exciting conversation to have with them.
No, I bet. Well, I loved, Jim, your description. I'm not going to be able to quote your words exactly, but that the design, your design intent was not that it be driven by function. And I actually have always thought that public buildings need to expose their function, right? Because it's a way for the public to understand what it is that both government does, but also what a building does in the service of some function. And so I was really interested in that. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on that idea.
Well, that's an interesting proposition, right? I mean, in modern society, many things are concealed from us. A Tesla looks pretty much the same as any other automobile, right? It might have a funny front end, but other than that, who knows what's under the sheet metal? And we press the gas pedal and away it goes. And so many things are like that, right? And that's, I think, the worst thing for any society is not to know what it is that you're dealing with, buying, working with, what consequences it has for all the things that, whether it's your pocketbook or when you have to go to throw it out, or how soon you have to throw it out. So this idea of making buildings that talk to you or explain themselves is very important to us, because that's, we kind of turn them inside out in a way, right? We want you to see how they're made, how they're put together, how the pieces and parts work. We want the kids to see it. We want kids to walk into a building and wonder how that was done, and get a sense of, how you put it together. I mean, when I was a kid, there were all these games that you'd be able to manipulate and make things with. And we have it now, but unfortunately, they tend to be like these plastic snip together things, as opposed to, actually taking an element and bolting it together, or doing something else with it. So, I mean, that's definitely part of our interest. Make buildings that you can you could go in and kind of understand how to disassemble it yourself.
Well, maybe not disassemble it, but certainly appreciate how it was assembled and how it works, because I think, for instance, your air handling, your quick description of the air handling, I think I haven't stood in this space yet, but I hope to soon, that somebody probably could at least understand the rudiments of what's going
Yeah.
on, right? By just looking at what you've done and the way you've highlighted in the space and not covered it up, right? Because it might have been completely invisible to anyone.
Well, part of that is functional, you know, fur and dander and all the things that come with animals. You do not want them collecting in concealed spaces.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. So I'm having been a veteran of public capital projects myself. I'm sure that this project must have attracted a lot of public attention, and I'm interested in knowing a little bit about how you handled the public end of this project, and just in general, whether you encountered controversy around this. I know there's lots of people who are very adamant about animal care. But you know how your firm works with the city to both explain these projects as they're happening to the public, but also to deal with whatever controversy comes your way.
Well, that's an interesting question. You know, there are animal rights activists who take an extreme view that might be more than the city is willing to go for. Right. And so we have to negotiate a reasonable standard. Now, as it turns out, animal rights activists who weighed in early on, much of what they wanted has been accommodated, including the individual stalls for the dogs and so forth. But that's always it's a constant negotiation. I mean, publicly, the problem with a building like this is it's so compact and so complex. I mean, it has a surgical suite in it. It has well animal and sick animal holding. It has all kinds of requirements for sanitation. It's an expensive building. And the city had not built a new animal shelter before this. So their expectations in terms of the cost of such things were not realistic. And so we have to negotiate that too. We have to explain, well, why is this happening? And I think a lot of the politicians were like, well, how could that possibly have cost so much? It's just for the animals, right? But they are what they are in the end. And now the city's building a couple more, and the process has evolved in a good way, and with better understanding of what's really required to do this well. So
yeah. Well, I'll just share a little story that earlier this week I shared with Tom Foley, who's the commissioner of DDC, which is the agency that oversees a lot of capital work for the city, and one of his right-hand people, Becky Urich, that this project had won MASterworks, and it was the best building this year, and they were thrilled and went on to talk glowingly both about this project, but also about these other projects that they're very excited to be doing around the city with other animal care centers. So that was nice to hear. I know you've worked on many other city commissions, and I'd love to hear about them and a little bit about that kind of other kinds of projects that you've worked on. But I did want to point out that you actually have won a previous MASterworks Awards before, one in 2015, which is a very relevant project perhaps to today. It was a prototype for emergency housing, and I'm just going to read quickly the way we described it. It won for Best Infrastructure, New York City Emergency Housing Prototype, Garrison Architects. Developed for New York City emergency management, these prototypes imagined a system of modular homes that would be deployed to house displaced residents in the event of an emergency. These multi-story, multi-family units can be deployed in less than 15 hours. The project is innovative in its willingness to address the city's climate change challenges and consider the role that prefabrication could play in meeting our most urgent housing needs. Certainly we have some urgent housing needs right now, but if you could tell us a little bit more about that project, I think we'd all love to hear about it, and delighted to hear about other projects that you've worked on with the city too.
Well, thank you for asking about that. I mean, that is one of our most pressing needs right now. I mean, the it's interim post-disaster housing prototype.
Sorry.
big, long, description. And it was commissioned by the city after Hurricane Sandy in recognition of the fact that we need to be able to move quickly when we need housing in an emergency situation. Of course, you have to figure out where you're going to put it, and you have to pay for it, and you have to find the people who are going to make it. But it was a good program. The building is very, very simple, made with sort of standard elements so that, 10, 20 manufacturers across the United States, or even internationally, could make it. So in the case of any disaster, it could be made and put in place. But it's different. It was in part a response to the FEMA trailer. So the FEMA was part of the client base for this. And of course, FEMA trailer is notorious for its formaldehyde cabinetry, and it's also notorious because the communities that it makes are notoriously uncommunicative. They are not communities. They are the blank ends of mobile homes. They're a disaster. So this housing was made to make urban neighborhoods. It's basically our 4-story walk-up housing that we have throughout our city, which is probably the best part of our city. So, it's out there. Now, we recently proposed to the city that it be used to house our 100 now million migrants, or 100,000, sorry, migrants.
Yeah.
And
don't rush us.
Not that big. So we looked at it on Floyd Bennett Field. We looked at it in the Aqueduct Racetrack. And it can be used and it can be manufactured. Now, the funny thing is, we also did a pro forma to see how much it would cost. And if we built 3,000 units of housing, if the city got on it, if they'd done it 6 months ago or a year ago, they would be saving $1 billion a year right now. This is the thing that is crazy making about all of this. We need to get smarter and able to move when these things happen to us and take advantage of these things, because we need the housing. I mean, we still have, I don't know what the shortfall is at the moment. It's probably 300,000 or 400,000 units in this city. So we need the housing. We need to make good neighborhoods. There's no reason we can't turn a problem into an opportunity.
Yeah, MAS, you may know, a number of years ago, and we're just in the process of updating it, actually did a database and a map that allowed you to identify city-owned property, because I think that there's a tendency on the part of mayors to think, well, Central Park, Flushing Meadow, when the truth of the matter is that the city owns tons of land which it could deploy for these purposes, if it sort of were to be thoughtfully integrated. And to your point, doing planning enough in advance so that when the emergency happens, they have a plan and they know where they're going to put it, and they can think about how to make that happen quickly. Well, I did the prototype ever get, you must have built a version of the prototype just to test it out, yeah?
Oh, the prototype exists up in Cabinet Plaza.
Oh, really?
Yes, and the head of OEM resides in the top apartment. Yeah.
Okay, we need to do a tour of that too, Jim.
And
fantastic.
The funny thing is, when we finish these, so there's a whole controversy in the world about what refugee housing should be, right? Mm-hmm. And after looking at this with my partner Deb Gans for years, and we've come to the conclusion that housing is housing, that everyone deserves some reasonable level of housing. So the funny thing is, when we finished the housing prototype, some of the folks walked through it and they said, "This is too nice. People will want to stay here." So there you go, right? There you go.
We will not spend our time today debating the current debate about whether or not New Yorkers or even people who come here have a right to housing, because that's a whole other topic.
Indeed,
and we probably all need a drink in our hand when we're talking about it. But I'd love to hear about other kinds of projects that you're working on for the city, or that are, you're working on for private clients. We'd love to hear more about that.
Well, we finished a landscape hotel. We've been making landscape hotels lately. Two young men started a project in the Catskills, landscape hotel. They're Williamsburg art industry types, and they started something called Pial, right near Catskill, New York, and they were fantastic. And so we were able to realize a kind of architecture that we seldom get to realize, because you need a really dedicated client. And so check that out, and go up and stay in one of the cabins, because it's great fun. It's connects you with nature. You lie in a big king size bed with fabulous thread count sheets, and you open the door and the deer and the animals come up to the edge of the place, and it's fantastic. It's like camping without the bother.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. I'd like to turn a little bit to your teaching work, and I guess I'd be interested a little bit to hear what kinds of themes your upcoming architecture, the future generation of architects are focused on, and what kinds of things are on their minds as they begin to enter the career that you've been in for so long.
Well, one thing that I always think about in this is that, so many people will say to me, surprisingly young people will say, kids today, they're not, right? They're unmotivated. They're not so smart. They are whatever problem they perceive to hoist on the kids. Well, that's just not the case. The kids are spectacular. They're spectacular. They're insightful. They're motivated. They're intelligent in ways that, those of us of a certain age could never have been, because they are they're the repository of decades of knowledge, and that shows. They're smart kids. They care about the world. They work hard. So, and sustainability, and a kind of in architecture, we go through phases where we become extremely abstract about things. It's either the idea of architecture or drawing architecture that is about poetics as opposed to what we make and how we interact with the world. And kids today are largely uninterested in that. And now some would say, and some of my older colleagues would say, for the worse, right? That the art of architecture is being given up for the pragmatism that's necessary for this world. But I don't see that as a bad thing, because the climate change and the housing and the nature of our cities, they have needs that have to be dealt with. And this is the time to be pragmatic. And art.
Well, you work at an institution that is very connected to the world, and thinking about themes of the moment. I occasionally am a critic for another architecture institution, which will remain nameless for this conversation, where I work and sometimes look at the designs for the only urban design course that these architecture students will ever have. And I often observe that many of those students have come expecting to be architects, where I think, we have many interns from Pratt happily reflecting exactly your experience, smart, motivated students from the preservation program or architecture or urban design, and they're very much thinking about the world, right? They're it's part of the beauty of the programs that you run. So congratulations for your part in that.
Pratt is one of the few places where the faculty actually talk to each other.
Well, I'm also interested in talking a little bit about the Design Excellence Program, because many of the projects that MAS has awarded MASterworks to over the years have actually come through that program. And I'm interested in I'm sure our audience would be interested in understanding a little bit more about David Verney's important role while he was at DDC in starting that program. But also I'm interested in your observations about where it is and what we in the advocacy community need to do to sort of make sure that the city is thinking about design excellence in its work.
Well, the city has been talking a lot about construction excellence, and I think that's a fine thing. I mean, I think we should, but I don't see that we should give up one for the other. They should both be in play. I think that the difficulties of building a public building in New York, whether it has design aspirations or it's the most simple, piece of infrastructure, are challenging. And, it's not, I mean, you have to have an active client. I mean, some architects will go overboard, and you have to have an active client who says, well, no, that's too much, or it's too little, right? And I think also we have, as I said before, we need to have an accurate budgeting system that makes the process more, linear. So, but these programs are, I mean, you can walk around the city and you can see the results of them, and they're tremendous, right? So I mean, I'm a great supporter of them, and I think we have to get to the point where we can do these buildings without it seeming as though they carry an overly large price tag or too much complexity or too much difficulty. I don't think they have to, but they need to be done intelligently. And this, really have to look at the whole system of building, and top to bottom, from programming and funding to execution. And then I think we can start to make better sense of it. One of the things that the GSA did, this is during Al Gore's time, is they actually looked hard at the way in which the projects were administered, and actually reduced the number of people involved in the kind of the day-to-day parsing of the design and the construction process. They simplified it, but they had experts in contracts dealing with the money issues, and they had experts in construction dealing with construction issues. That was fantastic. I mean, it was a very easy process. And so I think we could learn a little bit from that.
Yeah, I have been involved in some very big, complicated public projects myself over time, and I must say, just the innovation of having a construction manager who's ultimately going to deliver and oversee the construction aspects of the project, working with side by side with the design team for buildability and all those kinds of things, has just like made a huge amount of difference, both in terms of the efficiency with which decisions were made, but also just avoiding costs that would have just shown up later, right? In the later stages of a process when it's the most expensive to fix it, for sure. And I guess I'm curious whether you are of the mind that we need to bring more attention to these projects. I'm kind of thinking about MAS's role here a little bit. What are the kinds of things we can do to push harder to make sure that these design excellence projects are acted on?
I think what you're doing something extremely important, which is really to show us what the results are of an effort, on the people's behalf to design good buildings. And I also think it's good to talk, do exactly what we're doing, talk about this process a bit. You mentioned construction managers. The construction I think there's a kind of misapprehension in general that the general contractor that used to be the mainstay of construction is still an effective construction entity. And although they might be, in many instances, they're not. They simply don't have the resources or don't have the ability to control the subcontractors. Things go wrong. The construction manager becomes, an entity that can see the problems sometimes before they come up, can help parse the various contractors that come on. They're very, very useful now. And so they're a necessary part of our work. And yeah, but they've got to be active. They've got to be the right people. They've got to have the motivation. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I also think, we as an organization want to push the city always to be testing theories of new approaches. The thing that I'm thinking about is that as part of our Fight for Light project, we were really talking about the experience of sunlight and so on city streets, which is often the only place that people get to be outdoors in New York City. And so one of the things that we had recommended was the city begin to experiment and really thinking as they build buildings about not just the buildings themselves and the immediate landscape, but also the effect of the buildings on the street. And, does it enhance that experience and so on? And I'm reminded of an experience I had waiting to be a juror at the Queen's Courthouse and on a very cold morning. The line of the people out on the street experiencing the cold, some people very old, some people, with disabilities and so on, and nobody really thinking about this experience that they're all having as jurors, that they're standing on this sidewalk wrapped around this building. But my point is only that I think many of us in the advocacy community want the city to be the leading edge of trying things. And I think that that's a double-edged sword. You want always the city to build things that are going to be very durable and last for a really long time. But I do think there's public policy that should be embedded in these policies, that sort of examples of the best kind of work that the city and architecture should be expected to deliver in New York City. So,
well, that's interesting what you're saying. I'm thinking about, as you're talking about that, I'm thinking about Carl Friedrich Schinkel in a certain era in architectural history, when the building within the city was a kind of chess game. You made a move and the next architect made a move and they made a move and they made a move. So they basically, it added up to something when you were done, right? And right now we have a problem because each building kind of spins on its own. And I can't help but thinking of Raphael Vignoli's building in London, who, look, Raphael was a friend and he was a wonderful architect, but that building cooked a couple of automobiles, right? Because of the sun dropping off the glass, and we use too much glass.
Right.
We used to, it affects the sound. I take my students for a walk around the city and take them from a place of tall towers, reflective surfaces, into a brownstone neighborhood or a neighborhood of masonry buildings with texture, and all of a sudden everything changes. The sound of the city changes. Everybody calms down, and we there's way too much glass. It's nuts.
Yeah.
So
absolutely, I agree with you. All one has to do is to be in Midtown in the middle of the summer and come out to a leafy neighborhood in Brooklyn or Queens or the Bronx, and you notice the temperature change just all by itself. So speaking of heat island, right? Well, our time has flown by, and this has been a totally fascinating conversation. I thank you so much for taking the time, James, and Anthony too, wherever you are in the background. We appreciate your taking time to explain this project, and congratulations again. It's really a stunning little gem, and we hope it functions for a long time into the future. I also want to thank the MAS staff who've helped coordinate today's program. Our programs team is looking, as I mentioned earlier, to find a time to do an in-person visit to the Animal Care Center. So I hope you'll stay tuned for details about that. Thank you to all of you who've joined us this afternoon, and special thanks to MAS members. If you're not a member, I hope and you enjoyed this program, I certainly hope that you will consider joining. Your membership is essential to supporting us in our programs and advocacy towards a more livable city. Please see the chat for more information about how to support MAS. And we hope that we'll see you in an upcoming program or tour. We have a handful of more in-person MASterworks programming happening this fall, plus some book talks, which we'll be announcing soon. We're continuing the MASterworks celebrations with an in-person award ceremony on Wednesday, November the 8th. From 6 to 8 at the Center for Architecture. I hope you'll come join us there and actually meet Jim and Anthony in person. I hope you'll both be there. We will present each project with their awards, and we're intending to have a little conversation amongst the awardees, and also a little chance to chat informally over wine and cheese. So please RSVP either in the chat or to the listing on our website. We also invite you to join us at the Ford Foundation on Monday, November the 13th for a live recording of the podcast Person, Place, Thing with Randy Cohen. Randy's guest will be Kelly Garrod, the director of new works at the Apollo Theater. And I've had a chance to hear from her a little bit. She's fantastic. I really urge you to join us. Details for buying tickets for that are also in the chat. Find our full tours and events calendar at mas.org. And once again, thank you so much for joining us today. And we wish you a wonderful autumn weekend, and hopefully with a little less rain than's predicted. Thank you all. Take care.